Welcome to the wonderful world of wine. We are your hosts, Mark Lindsay and Kim Simone, exploring all things wine with you. We are a program that is supported by Franklin Public Radio, and you can find us on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine. Hello again, everybody, and welcome to the wonderful world of wine. How are you, Kim?
I'm doing well, Mark. Good to talk to you again.
Always good to talk to you and our listeners about all things wine. And today we're joined by a very special guest, Ann Reynolds from Napa Valley, California. How are you, Ann?
I am well, Mark. Glad to be here.
Thank you for joining us. And Kim and I have been bugging Ann for a long time about a few things in the wine world, and we thought it's about time that our listeners would get to know her. So, Ann, can you please tell our listeners about your wine background and about your company?
Sure, glad to. So I am a very specialized area in the winery world. I am a winery compliance consultant. So, and to kind of put that in a nutshell about how did I become such a unique professional? Well, I did grow up here in Napa. Napa is my hometown. I did not set out to get into the wine business, but the chances were fairly likely that I would end up working in it at some point, if you will, in the form of a job. My schooling background is actually in education. So I attained a bachelor's degree and then followed it up with a teaching credential. And it was a terrible time to try and find a full-time teaching job. So 30 years ago, this is my 30th anniversary, 1993, I found a job working at Behringer Vineyards in St. Helena as a harvest lab technician. And I just thought that was going to be a temporary thing. And then I would go back to teaching. However, as you can see, it did not. The wine industry, it's one of those stories where it just took off from there. Opportunity after opportunity after opportunity kept presenting itself to me in different jobs and different wineries, and I was always up for the next thing. And so, like I said, that was 1993. By 1998, I am now working at Sterling Vineyards in Calistoga, California. At that point is where I started doing the compliance area all wineries are required to be doing. And so, it was just the next opportunity. The winemaker says to me, hey, we just started with this database software to track our wines. Would you take on managing that software? And I said, sure, because it was just the next thing to learn. That was always what worked well for me. But like I said, that's compliance. So wineries are required to be tracking the activities of their wine, what I call their wine's lives. So you receive in a truckload of grapes. You crush those grapes into, tank 5. You add this kind of yeast and this kind of nutrient, et cetera, to it. You ferment it. How many gallons after it finishes fermentation do you get from those grapes? What happens to it throughout the rest of its life? It goes into barrels, it then gets blended, and then goes in the bottle. All that stuff is supposed to be tracked and recorded. And then, as we'll talk about in a bit here, a lot of that information ties directly to what they can or can't put on the label for that wine. So that's what I was doing, which was thoroughly interesting to me because it was so much and a lot of stuff to keep track of. And I'm a naturally organized person. So I had the wonderful, wonderful experience of getting to work at wineries because that's the best way to learn this stuff. So I'll forever be grateful for that. But it also made me realize that there's no training in my area. Winery staff get little to no training in the stuff that it took me years to learn over the years working at wineries. So fast forward a few more years later, I started the business. I started my business 14 years ago, Wine Compliance Alliance, and to work with many of my clients are existing wineries. I'm managing their reporting for them, but also a big chunk of my business is about providing training, because I know a lot of people are out there where I was 30 years ago, feeling lost, feeling confused, having lots of questions. And there was really no, there's no training out there. It's fascinating to me. People go to our UC Davis or Fresno State, couple here in California, or Cal Poly, and get a degree to become a winemaker, or get a degree to grow grapes, or what have you, all these other areas, but there's still nothing. Nobody goes to a university and gets a degree in winery compliance. There is no such thing. But yet every single winery in the country is required to be doing it in various forms. So that's kind of it, if you will, in a version of a nutshell.
I think it's very interesting to hear your side of what compliance is in the wine world. My husband also works in compliance, but in a different sector. So when I originally talked to Mark about we were going to have you on the show, and I was like, oh, compliance, I know what that is all about. And then I went through your website and I'm like, oh, no, wait a minute. This is different than what I was thinking. But it really makes me think like, wow, there are so many different ways that people can get into the wine industry. First of all, it's like we all have these different paths, and it's not just all about going to school to learn to be a winemaker, but then also to think about, yes, it's a business as well, and to think of the very important kind of businessy side of things that needs to happen in order for a winery to be successful. So it was, yes, I think, kind of nice to sort of, flip that narrative. And it's not just, the romance of the grapes and, harvest time and stuff like that. But it's like, oh, yeah, there's paperwork. And somebody has to be able to know it.
There's all that paperwork, if you will, behind that romance. Because you're right. I've often said that all that romantic language, so to speak, that you see in the advertising, or maybe you read on a wine label, or people such as winemakers love to spout about when we harvested these grapes and where, and et cetera, here's how we made it, all this kind of stuff. But where does all that come from? It comes from their records. So that's what I will often say. That's all that stuff. It's all compliance.
And is mostly what you do kind of more internal, where I know you mentioned wine labels, and we'll talk about wine labels in a few minutes, but is there like governmental things outside of the wine label specifications that you have to like submit information that it's important to keep track of appropriately at the winery, like that kind of thing?
Mm-hmm. In, what I will call my world of winery compliance, the lion's share of it will be federal. So that's the branch that used to be the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, or BATF. They've now been for quite a while now a different acronym, the TTB, Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau. So lion's share of it is them. They're the ones who are requiring lion's share of the records that wineries are required to be maintaining, which then directly relate to how they fill in certain reports. And then, like I mentioned earlier, directly relate to what they can or can't put on a wine label. Most of it, that's federal. However, like here in California, any California winery has a license with our California Alcoholic Beverage Control Department. They have a license with, of course, our tax office folks. And then many of them are going to have a license with yet another California agency, our California Department of Food and Agriculture. The record keeping for that second group of 3 California agencies is going to be a lot less than the federal. Lion's share, like I said, is federal. And a lot of times, a lot of the numbers that those California agencies are asking for will come directly from a lot of the federal reports that a winery is keeping.
So it's like it goes to the federal government and then back to the state government.
Yeah. Often you're right. Exactly.
Yeah.
The state form will say, here, tell us this number for your, previous year. And then they'll reference in the instructions comes from, and they'll give the federal form number.
First off, when did compliance really kick in? And is it all really just related to taxes? Is most of it tracking how much you're making, tracking your alcohol, and all? Is it all really so tax can be taken from it?
A good amount is related to, so wineries are required to pay excise tax at the federal level. That's the TTB. And then they're also required to pay it at their state level. And then related to that federal level, winery that's making, say, 5,000 cases of wine a year, but how much are they actually, because their excise taxes depend on how much they are actually selling, if you will, because that's really truly when a winery has to owes excise taxes at the federal or state level. So you're right. A huge part of it is about excise tax, how they are maintaining their records, meaning like details in their records, how they are then filing the reports. That's a real common area that you probably wouldn't be surprised gets audited frequently, is around, say, a winery that's been in business for, I don't know, whatever, say 10 years, for example, and they've never filed a report or something. That could be a red flag to that federal agency to audit them, because there is actually public information on that TTB's website about when they have audits, and they will literally name the winery, for example, or the brewery or whoever it was, and say, due to what was the reason for the audit issues, due to lack of tax payment. So they are keeping an eye on things. They do obviously have auditing authority. And you're right. The most common issue that we see on those is due to lack of report filings. And certainly that potentially means the excise tax report. Because you're right. That's a big chunk of their revenues, right, is excise taxes.
So it sounds like the TTB, state and federal IRS, they can have a lot of people really come down on them if they don't really do this compliance properly.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I like to, you're right. I mean, I don't necessarily like to think of the, what is the phrasing that, I don't want to motivate people with a stick. I want to motivate them with a carrot kind of thing. Yeah. But you're right. The stick can be that you don't want a TTB audit, do you?
I could see how wineries would just be, let's start a winery and I want to make wine, but they don't know what you're teaching. And they must be pretty amazed when they hear what they need to do and all this work.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I've definitely seen plenty of long time winery folk here in just, my own backyard, Napa County, Napa Valley, are unaware. I mean, for example, even if just some label items, maybe they've had a winery for decades and they're a big name in the winery world. And then because I had the experience working at wineries where I would come in, say, like newer in my working for them or something, and I would point out something on their label. Oh, you can't put that on there because this and that, and the wine doesn't qualify for it. And they would say, oh, we never knew that's what that meant. So, I think you're right. I know that is extremely common. There's not that many. And again, I'm not certainly always want to clarify. I'm never faulting wineries. I'm never faulting them, because you're right. You put in an application to become a winery. You get that application approved. Now you can start making wine and all this. But nobody says, they might say in like a sentence or two in an approval letter, hey, you're supposed to be keeping these certain records and spout some code of federal regulation numbers. That's it. That's all they get in the heads up. By the way, you're supposed to be doing these things. And that's it. So, like I said, I never fault wineries, but I've spoken to so many people over the years who say, yeah, I feel like I know just enough to be dangerous, but I'm always leery that I'm not doing it right. I'm always leery.
One of those instances of not knowing what you don't know.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just saw you wrote a blog about direct shipping compliance. And now this is another thing that's come up. There's issues where now the wineries have to be compliant when they ship to every state, and every state's compliance is different, correct?
Yeah, it's a zoo. You're right. You've got 50 different sets of regulations.
They have to know where they can ship, where they can't,
much,
and how much they have to pay each state every year for a permit.
Do you deal with that kind of compliance stuff too?
I can't stand that area. So yeah, I was going to clarify.
It's good to be open about it.
There's like these two main parts to, if you say winery compliance, what I call wine production compliance, which is my area, which is kind of the little blurb that I described before. And then you've got that whole wine shipping area, which like I said, I can't stand. I don't go anywhere near because I can't stand it.
Wow.
We all
But
have
you're
what we
right.
don't like about our jobs.
Yeah, exactly. Because to me, my area is interesting. It's the stories of wine's lives and all the numbers and the blends and, whatever, where the grapes were grown, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's all those stories. But shipping is just this zoo, and it's just, insane. And it's, to me, is just really dry and tedious. But yeah, it's tends to be the hotter topic, not surprisingly, in the wine world, because obviously that's where the sales are happening, right?
So what about within the state, Ann? There's the California just passed the wine bottle deposit. Is that going to be another level of compliance for state filings that they're going to have to be on top of, that you're going to take care
I'm
of?
going to actually, I haven't seen the nitty gritty of what, if that will even come into say what I'm going to call my world. Because you're right. I've seen the different headlines about it and just have kind of skimmed them a bit. I mean, I know it potentially will be something that will go on a wine label, for example, but some of that stuff, I could tell you the TTB, which is, what I would care about, they don't care about. They don't care about stuff like that, if you will, in their regulation part.
They don't care that California gets its 10 cents a
Exactly.
bottle.
The feds, they don't, because they're the feds, right? We don't care about what California says. They regulate that. We regulate our thing.
It's just so interesting, all the stuff these wineries have to do, and
yes,
all that you so I can see where your experience and knowledge in dealing with it all, how you can really start your business, how you did to get people to go. I've been bugging you a lot about, I noticed you had some starting to host classes, and people can find out a lot of that information when you do them on your website, winecompliancealliance.com, and see more of Ann's story there. But such an interesting background thing that wineries have to know.
Yeah, exactly. And along the lines of, like I was pointing out, that there's still hardly anything in the way of formal training for winery staff. There's still not that many offices like mine. If you just were to Google wine compliance, I mean, I know for sure my business is going to come up on page one.
Right.
But like I said, I've been in business 14 years now, and that's exactly what I do. Every now and then I go and I Google wine compliance, and maybe I see a new name. Oh, hey, there's another new office. But yeah, there's a definite need for, well, both. For sure, the training for staff who are out there at wineries who need it, which is a real range of people. It could be a winemaker, it could be an office staff person, it could be a controller, kind of across the map, who it might be at a winery. And then the potential, however it pans out for more compliance offices to open up, because I just know that there is still a huge demand for the services. So for sure, if anybody listening has ever wondered about getting into the world of winery compliance, I mean, I would encourage that. I mean, one of the ways that I have recommended to people over the years, if it works out for them, I feel like probably this is heavily based on my own experience, so my own bias from a positive experience, but starting working at a winery during harvest.
The busy time.
It's so much fun, but then you're getting all that exposure to that beginning stage of wine life, which yes, is romantic. But you can start to see, you're starting to get an exposure potentially to, like I said, that wine life story, and whatever, say in contact with an office like mine, they can start to go, oh, then you're supposed to be tracking this. And so they could potentially not only have what is a very unique experience, I think, working at a winery during harvest, but they're starting to dip their toe in the water to start to feel like, well, maybe this is an interesting thing that I might want to pursue further.
And that there are a number of different things you can do while still working either at a winery or in the wine world. It doesn't all have to be winemaking.
Exactly. Yeah.
You're listening to The Wonderful World of Wine, and we are your hosts, Mark and Kim. We are supported by Franklin Public Radio, WFPR. And you can find our past episodes on SoundCloud or iTunes. Today we have a special guest with us, Ann Reynolds, and you can find more information about her at winecompliancealliance.com, more information about Mark at franklinliquors.com, and more about myself at commonwealthwineschool.com. So we're speaking to Ann Reynolds today from Napa, California, and she is a compliance expert in the wine world. And we've been talking a little bit about how she got where she is, how she started her company, kind of the various ways to get into the wine industry. And you mentioned something sort of fascinating and kind of plays into a lot of the things that we always talk about in our podcast. And that is that one of the interesting things for people with wine is the stories behind wines. And that this is one of the things that really appeals to people about wine is, what's the story behind it? And sometimes we think about the record keeping behind wine as not that exciting, but for you, that record keeping also holds that story of the wine. I just think that it's such a kind of a beautiful other way of looking at it. It's not just who are the people behind it, but also the lifespan of that bottle of wine. How did it start? Where is it getting to where it's going? And that is still, I think, an appealing story for a lot of people. And another big part of that is wine labels, which you do a lot of work with as well, correct?
That's correct. Yes, very definitely. Winery compliance means being directly involved in, what is called the design of a wine label, and then the other side of it, basically all alcoholic beverages that are sold, going out into being sold in commerce in the United States are required to go through a process that is called label approval. And that, once again, is with that federal branch, the TTB. So in the process of, say, you're at a winery and you're coming up planning to be bottling a wine, that label gets designed for that wine. Still, most commonly, when you think of a bottle of wine, it's got what we call a front label and a back label, two separate labels on each bottle. And so you have to, the winemakers, the owners, the marketing department, who knows? There could be a real gaggle of people who are involved in the design of what goes on the label. But then somebody like myself, that with that compliance perspective, needs to be involved in that, because there's certain items that have to be on every single wine label. And then there's certain items that if you will, perhaps cannot be on there. You have to have that person on staff, or however it comes into the mix, who brings in that compliance perspective. I say we often have to be the party poopers because we have to, and I'll just give an example of that, because say a winery is putting together a label, and I'm just going to go with a common one. It's a Cabernet Sauvignon, and they want to be able to put on the label, such and such a brand, Cabernet Sauvignon, Napa Valley. Now, which is segueing into my book, The Inside Story of a Wine Label, to list those two items I just stated. Cabernet Sauvignon is a grape varietal. Napa Valley is what is known as an American Viticultural Area, or AVA. If you put those on a wine label, the blend itself of those items must meet a minimum percentage requirement. So for a varietal, just to throw out those numbers at you, if I wanted to put that Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon on the front of my wine, the wine blend itself would have to be at least 75% Cabernet Sauvignon grapes, right? And then for the second guy, the AVA, Napa Valley, the wine blend would have had to have come from at least 85% of the grapes that became that wine would have had to have been sourced from within the boundaries of the Napa Valley AVA. So that's where, again, that compliance person who would know the wine's blend would be looking at those percentage numbers and perhaps saying, yes, it does qualify to list Cabernet Sauvignon and Napa Valley. Or, like I said, perhaps a lot of times we get to be the party pooper and say, sorry, this wine blend isn't at least 85% or 75% or whatever item we're talking about. So there's a lot going on around, just that part of the process, the design and approval of wine label, which is what that book is all about. I was really inspired to write that book about 10 years ago now already, mainly because I would read articles or blog posts or whatever that would be talking about wine label items. And what I would see again and again is either they were partially correct in their description of that percentage or explanation of an item, or they were basically wrong, and it would just really annoy me. And I just realized it took somebody like myself who'd been there doing the work at wineries, studying wine blends and being involved in the wine label design and approval process to really write the book on the stuff. So that's
Sounds like
really
that
where
would be
that
very
came from.
valuable to some of our students who get those questions on their exams.
Yes.
You know, the percentages
Yes.
in what state and in what grape variety. And
Yes, exactly.
all
It
of
could
that.
be the perfect study tool.
There you go.
Yeah, and for our listeners, you can get Ann's book on Amazon. It's the inside story of a wine label. Our listeners also know that, Ann, I'm a huge wine label geek. I've been bugging Ann.
I was
with
gonna
emails.
bring this up.
Yeah, since I got your book, probably.
I'm like, do you know Mark
Yeah.
loves wine
Yeah.
labels?
It's all about, like you're saying, Ann, you see stuff on the internet and you're like, I don't think that's true. I'm going to go to Ann's book, or I'm going to research. And you put actual numbers, which for years being in the industry, you never knew that there's actual percentages, actual numbers that go to these statements. And you put it in this book and you break the label down. And it led to Kim and I having these ideas of wine classes where people, hey, this is what's on the label. This can help you become a better wine shopper, a better
Yes.
wine educator. And I just recently had a class, and Ann commented on my post because I named my class The Truth and Lies of Wine Labels. And Ann immediately said, what's the lies, right? And that's the way I kind of draw people in, say, hey, look at the label. What I mean by lies is, like, if you shopping for wine, you say, I want a Cabernet, and you know your profile, and you say, I want a Cabernet that's 100% Cabernet, and the person selling you the wine doesn't know, like, the facts of the wine. I mean, that's the way you really test people. But thank you for the book, Ann. And I actually have it in my bag every day. It's all wrecked now. I always go to it. And I think the one thing, and I talk to Kim about this all the time in our listeners, the one thing that always confuses me, and I think I finally understood it, is the name and address statement on the label.
Yeah.
Because I always would tell people, Google that, do a Google map search of that, and see if it's an actual winery or actual location. You can kind of tell something about the wine. Do you think that is a truth to tell people?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example of, like, a, if you will, behind the scenes research. You're right. You pick up a bottle of wine and generally it's on the back, right? It'll say something like, say, produced and bottled by ABC Winery, Sonoma, California, for example. And you're right. If they go Google ABC Winery, and do they find an actual one, like a website that actually shows, here's our winery? Because you're right, a lot of the businesses might be what we call a custom crush client. So a custom crush client doesn't own a winery. They contract with a winery to make and bottle their wine, and then they go sell it. But they still might have a website, right? But if you go to their website, they're not going to be showing you pictures of a winery saying, here's our winery, because they don't own a winery. They have a wine business, but they're not the winery type of wine business.
Yeah. And it's not a quality thing either. To me, it's like, okay, I just want to know, like when you talk compliance and you're saying you have to track, here's all the tracking. I want to know, I want to track that bottle. And that's how I kind of use it. And then I recently was opened up to that a little more, where I actually meet winemakers and they tell me, it'll say vinted and bottled. It won't say produced and bottled by them. I'll say, why is it not produced and bottled by you? And they'll say, well, I get the grapes from this person, but I grow the grapes myself here, so I don't have my own crush facility. So now that story is an understanding of why it says what it says on the label. But you really have to dive into it. And years ago, I was like, well, it says cellared by or vinted by. I'm kind of turned off by it. But now I have more of an understanding, and it's all thanks to bugging you all these years about your book. So thank you for that.
Exactly. Yeah, because it does. It's just like my thing that I've observed many, many times over the years is being at here for sure. It's the grocery store because we have wine aisles, plural, in most of our grocery stores, right?
Right.
So you'll see somebody there and they're just standing there, just kind of almost with a glazed over look on their face because they're just staring at this wall of wines.
The deer in the headlights on the wine wall.
How do I begin to know? And so that was the other thought that came was this book is, as you mentioned earlier, Mark, is to potentially to, if you will, empower people to just have a more interactive experience with shopping for wine. It can be so overwhelming. Strongly feel that it doesn't have to be.
Is it checked though, Ann? Once it's submitted and approved, is it checked again that there's really 75% or more Cabernet, or it's really is that going back to the compliance if they want to check?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. That's the perfect question, because you're right. When that label approval process, you're right. They're only looking to see, does it have these required items in the required location? They are not checking the blend. That's not involved in that label approval process. When a wine does get checked, does it meet the minimum percentage requirements that you listed on the label, is when a winery gets audited.
Is that why there's always discrepancies between what's on the label and what's on the tech sheet?
Yeah.
Does any of that ever match the compliance sheet? You know what I mean?
I think it would be safe to say it's still probably extremely common, a decent amount of wines that are out there that don't meet the minimum percentage requirements for what they listed, in large part because nobody was aware of what those were, right. That whole lack of training thing.
That should be your next book, too, tech sheets, because Kim and I talk about that all the time.
Love tech sheets.
The labels and the tech sheets help you become a way better.
Yeah, if you had those side by side, yes, because they should be happening side by side. They aren't always, but they should be, because they are direct. One's directly connected to the other. One actually, the blend is what's driving the label, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So what's your thoughts, Ann? There's a lot out there in the wine world, and Kim and I have talked the subject a few times, that people are pushing for nutrition values on labels. Do you think this is something that will happen and something that's going to be a client's nightmare or label nightmare? Are you going to see both sides in your position?
Yeah. So first answer, yes, it will happen. That's been my impression. I've seen the announcements from the feds, the TTB. Yes, it will happen. I have not seen black and white, and I don't think they've landed on it either yet. What will that look like? Will that mean you're going to have to put that additional, take up another chunk of valuable space on a label, right? To put the nutrition label in, or whatever that format is. Or, because of the other one I've seen as perhaps option B, is a QR code.
Yeah, I like that.
That would get my thumbs up, because maybe it's just whatever, the time period that I've been in the wine industry, but I don't, and then I also don't really totally agree with a lot of it, because as you're probably familiar, a lot of the items that go into wine, if you will, are not in the finished product.
Don't you think that's why the big companies...
this all the time.
Yeah.
And the confusion on the one hand, it's good for the consumer to know what they are putting in their bodies. But then on the other hand, there's so much complexity with wine production that if you're talking about finding and filtering, those things are no longer in the wine. So it's more,
it's not apples to apples with food. It's not.
Don't you think the big companies will want the QR code versus...
Yeah, I would say the lion's share of wine businesses would want the QR code.
Yeah.
And you're right, especially the big boys who are putting in perhaps some more questionable products.
Yeah, and we talk about that a lot too.
Yeah.
You had another blog, I just want to hit real brief, that you had a statement, produced by fermentation. Is that a new address bottling statement that's out there? What was that in regards to?
Well, so that statement, produced by fermentation, is literally the title of a line on the federal report that every single winery in the country is required to file. And when a winery puts gallons on that line, that means they're saying, we just completed fermentation of this many gallons, whatever. We received in so many grapes, they became produced by fermentation this many gallons. That's I talk a lot about that line of that report because, like we're just talking about, or we were talking about earlier, if you pick up a bottle of wine and it says produced and bottled by such and such, that word produced, minimum 75% of the wine in that bottle must have been fermented at that winery that bottled it, meaning they produced it by fermentation.
So does that mean wineries that are actually fermenting their own wine are doing more paperwork and possibly paying something more than if someone who sourced fermented juice?
Well, no, because when the paying part, the excise tax really is just tied directly to, I'm trying to think of a way to kind of simplify it, but the amount of gallons, I guess I should say, the amount of gallons that any given winery lists as produced by fermentation there may or may not be a direct correlation to that they're going to pay taxes on that same amount. Just depends. Do they later bottle all those gallons? Yeah, then potentially they're going to pay taxes on that amount, but maybe they don't. Maybe they sell off some of those gallons or things like this. So it isn't necessarily a direct line.
Do they have to track that too? And
yep.
if you're selling juice, if I sell wine to Kim, you have to say how many gallons Kim got from me, and then she has to report that
she
as well?
received the same gallons. Yeah. And you have to create a document that goes along with that truckload of wine that breaks down the percentages of it by vintage, varietal, and appellation, because then that means that she knows what she can qualify to put on his label.
It sounds to me just to like a non-business ear that it's like, oh, by fermentation, does that mean that the rest of it is distilled? Like, sort of one of those questions. It's like, well, duh, of course, by fermentation, like you're making wine.
Yeah, you're making wine.
It's such an interesting way to phrase it.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, and like I said, I will forever be grateful. That's where I learned it. I was working at wineries, getting to inhale the wonderful aromas of fermentation and getting sticky and stained and things like this while I was learning it. So, I mean, I get it. I can talk to any winery in the country about what they're doing and go, okay, that's what that means for your reports, for your taxes, for your labels, because of that. Because it fit my nature too, I should say.
There's so much backstory to it that people probably never knew all the paperwork. Yeah. So if I was making wine, I'd say, Ann, come in and just please do this for me or take it over, please. So you're almost like the tax person, right? I mean,
yeah, you're right.
Yeah, you're like the accountant for wineries.
Yeah,
totally. I mean, that we've joked about it over the years, that we should like get a recording of talking to various people across the wine biz, but whatever, talk to the stuff they like to talk about. And then at a certain point in the conversation, say, what comes to mind when I say to you the word compliance, because everybody makes a face. They roll their eyes or they grimace or they make an unhappy face. But compliance, it's like, no, this is, if you know what you're doing, and it's all these numbers and all these details that, winemakers and marketers love to talk about.
And it's so important because if you get it wrong, then you can be in some serious trouble. So it really does make sense to have somebody who is smart about it and knows what they're talking about, like yourself.
Exactly. Yes. Who can, make it not be a drudge.
With all the label submissions now the TTB's going through, do you think they're just using AI to view them now? Like, does someone physically really looking at that?
Yeah, that's hysterical, because that is the hair pulling scenario that is federal TTB label approval. It comes down to, I don't know how many people they have back there. It's in Washington, D.C. I do know that. That's where label approvals happen. I just pictured this sea of cubicles. But you're right. When I say the hair pulling experience, because, I, as a winery, maybe I've been bottling a wine for 10 years, and so there's like only, I changed the vintage on the wine and, like nothing else. And then I make one, whatever little change to the label, and I submit it for label approval 10 years later, and the person rejects it. And you'll say, well, what? You guys approved it for the past 10 years. And the person will say, we don't care. You can't, we're not
You're doing it wrong now.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's because it comes down to literally what person in cubicle A might reject your label, but person in cubicle B might approve it. And it's the same label because you've got that human factor. So you're right. Until we can give it to a computer, whatever, non-human technology, the wine industry is still going to be frustrated by that process, label approval, where the same label gets rejected.
How long does it usually take for submission?
They're very quick. It's like less than a week. They're very good.
And I saw some stat where between beer, liquor, and wine is actually the least amount of labels they review. Is that true?
The most.
It's the most.
But yet we are on the flip side of that. I believe it's correct. We're the small. I don't know if we're the smallest in volume of both beer and spirits, but gallon amount wise, we're the smaller of at least one of those.
But the most label approved.
But the most label submissions. Yeah. Well, you think about it. How many wine brands are there? And it's insane.
I was thinking beer because every day a new craft.
I was thinking beer too. I feel like there's always new stuff coming out.
They turn them over so fast.
Yeah, there's an insane amount. I mean, like people contact my office because they want to get started with a new wine business. And so we have our conversation and such. And at one point I do ask them, do you know who are your people? Who's going to buy your wine? What's your thing? What's your story? Who's your people? Because I know that there's so much product out there. It's like, I'm hoping they've given some thought because that's the hardest thing.
Who's your market?
Yeah.
Is there a site you can go to see like top 5 wine corporations, the biggest, how much percent?
Yeah. Wine, I want to say, is it Wine Business Monthly?
Oh, they put out reports.
Tracks that. And then every year in January of every year, they put that out.
Wow.
So it's of course, it's, of course, number one, because they're in their own galaxy, Gallo. It's like, put them over here. They're in their own galaxy. And then you've got, Kendall Jackson is still up there, Constellation, who, bought Robert Mondavi and Franciscan and many others.
I would assume, like Kim was saying, you want to know your market. So they might, before they even create the wine, they probably create the label to see if it gets passed and then say, well, let's make a wine that goes with that label now.
And you're right. You're right. They have a completely, almost like the opposite of a business model from your, if you will, old school winemaker approach.
Wow. Interesting.
Yeah. And you're right. I mean, I heard a comment in one of your earlier podcasts about, you can't, any given amount of shelf space in the store, a lot of it is taken up by the big guys, right? Mm-hmm. But because they have 20 different brands, and how is a customer to know that? Yeah.
How are they to know that that label that they're looking at is actually just one product from this giant winery, and it's not, or giant wine company, and it's not like this tiny little winery, and there's a story behind it, and we have goats, and like that kind of
thing. They buy Ann's book. That's how we know.
That's right. Right? Yeah, exactly.
And you get to know Modesto, California.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Because you're right. That's who gets the shelf space.
Yeah. All right. Great. Well, Ann, thank you very much. This is,
thank you.
Listeners could probably tell I'm like super excited to pick your brain. And
you make a fairly dry topic sound very exciting. Like we can hear that you really love what you do. And I think that we do that all the time. It's like, oh my gosh, we get so excited about it. And you're like, yeah, I'm so excited about compliance.
I know. And you're right. Yes. And I think you're right, but it's great. This has just been a wonderful opportunity to, if you will, spread the word of this. I call it the unglamorous part of winemaking, but there's just so much to it.
But so necessary.
Exactly, it's so necessary, and it's good information.
Yeah, I think it's good. It excites me. So.
I love your wine labels, Mark. It's so funny.
Just all of it just gives us so much content to talk about and to educate people about and draw people's attention, like I did draw on yours when I said there's a lot of lies on the label.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but you're right. I'm the same way still at the store when I'm shopping for wine. I'm amused. I'm always looking at labels and I'm entertained by them just standing there in the store aisle.
Thank you for joining us today on The Wonderful World of Wine. We've been your hosts, Kim Simone and Mark Lindsay, with special guest Ann Reynolds from winecompliancealliance.com. You can find us on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine, and please check out Ann's book, The Inside Story of a Wine Label, which can be found on Amazon. Cheers.
Cheers.
Wine, wine.